Hello, my friends. This is Deepak, or again, as usual, speaking to influencers in our magical ecosystem. Anybody who's making a difference in the world. And I have the distinct pleasure today of having my brother, Sanjiv Chopra, who's a professor at Harvard Medical School. You'll see his credentials below. And we have Naidoo, whom you've met before. Naidoo is a nutritional psychiatrist and also at Harvard, and you know her from the Chopra Foundation. Thank you both for joining. Let me start right away with Sanjiv, and I'll be coming back to you as well. Sanjiv, the book is called Coffee, the Magical Elixir, Facts That Will Astound and Perk You Up. Of course, I wrote the foreword and I've read the book, but most of our audience will be actually quite surprised that you're talking about the benefits of coffee. And, there's lots of misconceptions in the world about coffee not being good for you and, probably keeping you up at night, cardiac arrhythmias, on and on. It's there's lots of myths about coffee. So why don't you clarify first the myths and why you wrote the book?
Thanks, Deepak. So, I got intrigued about coffee about 20 years ago. As you know, I'm a liver specialist, a hepatologist, and a study came out that people who drink coffee have lower liver enzymes in the blood. So high liver enzymes are usually indicative of liver damage. And then the studies came out that people who drink coffee have less fibrosis, scarring in the liver. If there's intense scarring, where islands of liver cells are totally surrounded by scar tissue, as you know, we call that cirrhosis. And then people are at risk for a number of life-threatening complications, the development of liver cancer, and the need for a liver transplant. Then studies came out that if you drink 2 cups of regular coffee a day, 50% reduction in hospitalization and mortality from chronic liver disease, which at this present moment we think afflicts 1.5 billion people in the world. And then studies came out, multiple studies. If you drink 2 cups of regular coffee a day, a 40% reduction in death from primary liver cancer. Primary liver cancer is the 3rd leading cause of cancer mortality in the world. And in 12 countries, Egypt, Vietnam, Mongolia, is the number 1 cause of cancer mortality. And then other studies came out, low risk in 6 other common cancers, low risk of type 2 diabetes, low risk of Parkinsonism, Alzheimer's. And if you already have type 2 diabetes and drink 2 cups, regular or decaf. So very important, it's not the caffeine. Coffee has 1,000 constituents. That if you already have type 2 diabetes and drink 2 cups of regular or decaf, 30% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. But the holy grail would be, if it's having all these amazing health benefits in different organs and systems, does it actually lower mortality? Do people live longer? And now there are 5 studies published in the New England Journal of Medicine, Annals of Internal Medicine, that people who drink coffee have low total and cause-specific mortality. And they're mechanistic explanations, I think.
Wait on that. I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
So, since you're a nutritional psychiatrist, Sanjeev is going to talk about mechanisms. Let me ask you, what do you think the mechanisms are? And also, if there's any effect on the microbiome that you know. And then I'll come back to Sanjeev.
Thank you, Deepak, and thank you, Sanjiv, for inviting me to do this. I wanted to be involved because I did really think that coffee is so beneficial, and your book really elucidated the science behind it and helped the work that I do, because so often people are asking me, should they drink coffee or should they not? And I'm always for coffee unless it precipitates something like an increased anxiety or discomfort or agitation and that type of thing, then it's not for them. But it doesn't actually mean that coffee isn't healthy. It just isn't healthy for them. Coming to Deepak's point about the microbiome, which is so unique in each individual. I'm not entirely clear of the exact mechanism, but what I do know is that coffee is rich in polyphenols, and these are extremely impactful in interacting with the gut microbes. We know this from things like the fiber in different plants, the colors of different plants, the different plant polyphenols, anthocyanins from blueberries, carotenoids from carrots. These interact directly with those microbes and help them thrive. So it's the fiber benefit, but also the polyphenols. I would defer to Sanjiv on the exact mechanism, but that's my understanding so far. And I also feel, based on my clinical experience, that not everyone responds the same way.
Okay, Sanjiv, so what do you have to say about the mechanisms?
So Uma hit it on the nail. The coffee actually changes the gut microbiome. Coffee drinkers have much more of anti-inflammatory microbes in the gut and less pro-inflammatory. And I think we're learning now that inflammation is the enemy. Inflammation is the enemy in cancer, in heart disease, in liver disease, not only in infectious diseases like COVID-19 and tuberculosis and HIV, but inflammation is the enemy. So there are two markers of inflammation: tumor necrosis factor alpha and C-reactive protein. And both those are lower in coffee drinkers. And then a lot of people have heard about telomeres and telomeres. As you know, Elizabeth Blackburn in 2009, with two other colleagues, got the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for her work on telomeres and telomerase. And here's the fascinating thing. We know that shortened telomeres are linked with accelerated cellular aging. Who has shortened telomeres? Mothers of chronically severely disabled children. The stress of taking care of them day in, day out. Caregivers of people with Alzheimer's. Who has longer telomeres? People who exercise, people on the Mediterranean diet, people who meditate, and people who drink coffee. And the amazing thing about the coffee study was that increased caffeine intake is linked to shortened telomeres. Increased coffee intake linked to longer telomeres. So if you and I have Red Bull or something with a lot of caffeine in it, multiple cups a day, we're going to die sooner. It's not the caffeine. Caffeine can be detrimental. The most recent study, or one of the recent studies, JAMA Oncology, people with advanced and metastatic colon cancer, it's already spread to the lymph nodes, the peritoneum, the liver, who drink coffee, including decaf coffee, have improved disease-free survival and dose dependent. In other words, 3 cups better than 2, 2 better than 1, 4 better than 3. I recommend we drink 2 to 4 cups as long as we don't have any side effects, which are rare and manageable. Today, a colleague of mine sent me an article presented at the American Cardiology meeting. And it said, people who drink coffee live longer and have less cardiac arrhythmias. There's been this myth that it's not good for the heart, that it may provoke arrhythmias. There's actually a low risk of a very common cardiac arrhythmia, atrial fibrillation, which untreated can lead to stroke. Lower risk.
Well, I've heard frequently that if you have cardiac arrhythmias and atrial fibrillation, you shouldn't drink coffee, but thanks for clarifying that. A very interesting question I have is that, we were also at our foundation looking at some of the research on COVID-19 and younger people who were, either meta-analysis, younger people who were succumbing to COVID, either mortality or morbidity at cytokine storms, and almost everybody, even the older chronic people, almost everybody had low-grade inflammation, low-grade anxiety, and low-grade depression at the same time. So I have 2 questions, obviously. When stress is happening, people have sympathetic overdrive. And then, meditation and chanting and vagal stimulation in general through yogasana and breathing techniques counters that, the sympathetic overdrive, by activating the vagus nerve. So there is some kind of intuitively, not scientifically, contradiction that stress increases sympathetic overdrive, and then coffee also helps. believe maybe not through vagal stimulation, other mechanisms. Uma, you said before, I believe to me, that most of the serotonin in our body comes from the gut, maybe even up to 80%. And serotonin is an antidepressant, as we know. So a little bit of intuitive contradictions here. I'd like to know your response, Uma, and then Sanjiv's.
I'm not sure that I have a clear answer. I mean, I do know that the vagus nerve is so powerful in terms of that gut microbiome and the gut-brain connection, and it is responsible for that communication between the gut and the brain, which is both bidirectional, and the fact that the serotonin receptors are largely housed in the gut, and that serotonin is produced there as well as the brain, but much larger component, Deepak, as you said, in the gut, probably even closer to 90%. And this also explains why an individual who's prescribed an SSRI like Prozac, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, initially has gastrointestinal side effects, which are some of the most common side effects. I think that I think for me it remains to be seen the exact mechanism. I think that we forget that the research around the gut microbiome is only, a decade and a half, although an abundance has been done. I learned this from one of Sanjiv's lectures, that there's a massive amount of research done between like 2012 and 2017. In fact, the bulk of it. So I'm hoping that more will be elucidated as we learn and understand. But I did want to also ask a question, Sanjiv, about when you say, I think this is something that would help people understand that how do we differentiate caffeine from coffee itself? And when you say it's, caffeine in fact can be unhealthy, how can we help break that down for people or unpack that information? Because a lot of people would then turn to Red Bull and those other drinks that are highly caffeinated, but they also have a ton of sugar in them. That's a whole other story. But how do you sort of
so coffee contains 1,000 constituents. It contains chlorogenic acid, which is the richest antioxidant known to man. It contains caviol. It contains cafestol. So in the laboratory, I can take an animal, give it the most potent liver toxin, destroy the liver, the animal dies. I can repeat the experiment, give the same toxin, but this time before giving the toxin, pre-treat the animal with caviol or cafestol. It totally abrogates the liver injury. Insulin sensitizing, that probably is the mechanism for protection, low risk in type 2 diabetes, which we call insulin resistance. The pancreas is still making insulin, but it's not having its desired effect on the cells. So I think we have to make that distinction. And unfortunately, people will talk about, a science reporter may talk about a study and talk about the health benefits of coffee, but the title of the study is Caffeine May Be Good for You. Sorry,
that is correct.
It wasn't caffeine, it was coffee. Let's make that very clear distinction about it. And in reference to the microbiome and the centrality of the vagus nerve and its connection with the brain, bidirectional, like you said, when you say I have a gut feeling, it's your gut microbiome talking. And when you look at Parkinsonism, a neurodegenerative disorder, the importance of the vagus nerve, people who've had a vagotomy have a low risk of developing Parkinsonism. Let me say it again. People who've had a vagotomy have a lower risk of developing Parkinson's, but it's seen with truncal vagotomy. There's something called supraselective vagotomy. You just take the branch that's going to the parietal cells, which make hydrochloric acid, and you cut that, it works for peptic ulcer disease. But those people don't get protection from Parkinsonism. It has to be truncal vagotomy.
So Sanjiv, given all this, would you recommend that we prefer decaf?
No. Regular coffee has much more robust benefits.
I
and
see.
it's not the caffeine. In the process of removing the caffeine, decaf coffee may lose some of its health benefits. So for liver disease, not all, but many of the original studies said it had to be regular coffee for protection. Now, if people can't drink regular coffee and can only drink decaf, that's fine, much more healthy. I got interviewed by BBC some years ago. They said there's a coffee shop in Adelaide, and the guy sells a coffee that has 16 grams of coffee
Of caffeine.
per cup. Now,
Oh,
the usual is 65 milligrams. Oh, sorry, he has 5 grams. So
of what?
of
Of
caffeine,
caffeine.
caffeine in 1 cup of coffee. And the usual cup that you get at any of the coffee shops will have 65 milligrams. So he has 8 times as many. Now, it turns out 13 grams is lethal, will kill you. So, and he apparently takes an interview before giving the coffee, but he's not a doctor. And the person who's interviewing may not know that they have occult heart disease or some other problem. And he calls it kick-ass coffee. And when I was interviewed, I said, I would change the name to Kick the Bucket Coffee. This is dangerous. And it's not the caffeine again.
Yeah.
Coffee has benefits. So I think I'm ostracized in Adelaide. I think I can't walk into Adelaide because it was on a big show.
Sanjiv, you also mentioned, I believe, 6 kinds of cancer. Which 6 kinds of cancer?
Yeah, so head and neck cancer, breast cancer, uterine cancer, colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, liver cancer, and skin cancer, including malignant melanoma. Now, in some, the reduction is 10% compared to people who don't drink coffee. For some, it is astounding. Metastatic prostate cancer, 50% reduction.
What's the mechanism there?
I think everywhere it's inflammation. I think it's fighting inflammation.
And Alzheimer's, the same thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of skepticism and people take a long time to come around. And if the average person even today goes to their primary care physician and says, I heard coffee is good for you, they'll say, oh, these studies come and go, everything in moderation. In reality, the studies on coffee have been coming and coming and coming. They're not going. And Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, I think said it best. He said, every truth goes through 3 phases. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as being self-evident. I think 10 years from now, people will say, we always knew coffee was good for you. What's the big deal?
And in Alzheimer's also, inflammation is probably anti-inflammation. Is that the same thing?
Yeah, if you look at Alzheimer's, people at autopsy can have a huge amount of beta amyloid deposited in the brain, but they had 0 symptoms during life. And that's because they did not have the neuroinflammatory tangles. So again, inflammation is the enemy.
And in mental health, in terms of depression, anxiety, cognitive disorders, and more and more studies have come forth showing that inflammation is really the underlying problem. And that is why we're now really starting to connect the dots between metabolic health and mental health. And COVID, of course, uncovered a lot of that with individuals who, during the very active phase succumbed to COVID. Those that survived have had a lot of emotional distress and actual increased depression and anxiety. But that brings me to a different point, Sanjiv. I do want to ask you, because as a chef, I not only love coffee, I actually bake with coffee. I do lots of stuff with it. But a lot of people get into the details of, well, it has to be a certain type of coffee. You have to do something to the coffee beans. They should be roasted. They should be. Is there much known about the actual health evidence around that?
I think the studies will be coming forth in the future. There are very few studies addressing this. I have a new friend, and he's actually starting a Boston Coffee Club, and he's starting a coffee university. And there'll be all the research about coffee there. So we'll find out more about about it in the near future.
We're getting towards the end of our half an hour talk, and I thank both Uma and Sanjiv for this absolutely astounding conversation. Sanjiv, would you end with a little bit of the history that you talk about in the beginning of the book? And we'll close with
I'll do that. I'll add one sentence quickly about Uma's question, which was about, what was it, Uma? Remind me.
About the type of coffee bean, like people get into, right.
So when people ask me that question, I say the best way to have coffee is to have coffee with a friend.
I like that. I'm going to use that.
And I actually said that in an interview with Chronicle recently. But previously I used to say to people, you know what? I don't know. I drink it black. My one refrain is do not add artificial sweeteners. They change the gut microbiome in a bad way.
Sure.
And a study came out in the Annals of Internal Medicine looking at more than 500,000 subjects from Europe, 10 countries. They all make the coffee differently. They drink it differently. They all had lower total, men and women, total and cause-specific mortality. So if you want to add a little bit of sugar, a little bit of milk or cream, as long as you don't have diabetes, go ahead. If that's the only way you can drink your coffee, drink it that way. Drink organic. Drink coffee with less pesticides. There should be a coffee rating system like we have for wines. And it should be based on how much chlorogenic acid, how much caviol, how much cafestol, contaminants.
I think you should create that.
And there's actually a movement to start doing that.
Because I think that would really help people.
We have less than 5 minutes.
Yeah, so very quickly. So coffee is called coffee because it originated in a village called Kaffa in Ethiopia. There was a goat herd by the name of Kaldi. He would take his goat for pasture. He noticed in one particular pasture, they were very frisky and animated. They were consuming these berries. He made a brew. He really enjoyed it. There was a monastery nearby. A monk would walk by and he would scold him. Kaldi, you have partaken of the devil's fruit. He ignored the monk. After a while, the monk said, let me try it. And he was able to stay up for the late night prayers. There's also a very fascinating story of Baba Badan, who was a Sufi mystic, and he was really revered by the Hindus and Muslims in India. And he goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Mecca that time used to be in Yemen. And he had his first cup of coffee and he was blown away. And he wanted to bring it back to India. He lived in a village near Bangalore, India. And if you smuggled coffee beans, the punishment, and you were caught, the punishment was death. You could take coffee powder. He wanted to take the beans. So he had a big beard. He put 7 beans in his beard, smuggled it, and brought it to India. India is now the 7th largest producer of coffee in the world.
Thank you, Sanjiv, and thank you, Uma. And this has been a delightful conversation.